Let's get started. I'm very pleased to welcome Dr. Alexander Nanni, who will be talking to us today about teaching writing in the new normal, lessons learned. And Dr. Alexander is an assistant professor of education at the Mindol University International College in Thailand. I hope I pronounced that right. You can correct me if I didn't. So over to you, Dr. Alexander.
Well, thank you so much, Simon, for the kind introduction. A big thank you to Cambridge for organizing this event. It's so wonderful to see people really from all around the world gathered together to participate. And of course, a big thank you to you, the participants, for participating. I know there are many, many things going on in our lives, and it's great we can get together for something like this. Thank you so much for coming to my talk. Today, as Simon mentioned, I'll be talking about teaching writing in the new normal, lessons learned. And this is under the theme of moving forward for this conference. My name is Alexander Nanni. I'm the Associate Dean for International Affairs, and I'm also an Assistant Professor of Education at Mahidol University International College in Salaya, Thailand, which is just about half an hour west of the Chao Phraya River, for those of you who are familiar with the area. And once again, we're all from different places. I won't spend too long talking about where I'm from, but I've been living and working in Thailand for about 15 years. Here are some pictures of our beautiful campus. You can see various colleges. There's the Thai house there in the middle where we have some ceremonies, engagement ceremonies, and other kind of formal events. And you can see the music college on the left, and at the bottom left. And in the middle, bottom middle, you can see me happily cycling. Oh, that's not really me cycling, but I do often jog down that path in the evenings. So this is where I'm from, and I'll be talking a lot about some different ideas relating to writing instruction and to teaching in general. We're all from different places, but really some of these bigger ideas do apply regardless of where we are. Now, of course, you do need to think about how it applies exactly to your context, but I'm going to try to give a mix of some big picture points and some specific examples of things that we can use, and you can pick and choose what fits depending on your needs and the needs of your students. Now, first of all, I'd like to start out with a few questions. And well, maybe if this were an in-person conference, you'd turn to the person next to you and discuss. But as it is, these are rhetorical questions, just some things to frame the points I'm going to go through, and some things you can just think about to yourself. And please do be honest with yourself as you ponder these points. So first of all, as a teacher or just as a relatively educated person, how well can you differentiate between text that comes from students and text that comes from AI or computers? I'll come back to this later on in the talk, but there have been some really interesting advances in AI recently that have some implications, I think, for our teaching. The second question to ponder: when was the last time that you personally, that is you, dear teachers, dear participants, you personally had to handwrite a high stakes text? That is, when did you have to do an essay test? When did you have to write a report by hand? That kind of thing. And the third question, and of course, we're all here today. We have 408 and counting participants, 410 and counting, 411 and counting participants in this session. We're all here because we care about writing and we care about instruction and we care about teaching. I don't doubt that, right? And that's evident. You're kind of voting with your feet. You're here because you're interested in thinking about how you can improve your teaching, which is great. But relative to all of your concerns in your life, how worried were you about writing instruction in 2020, 2021? I'm putting this in the past tense because maybe we're heading towards some kind of new normal, again, moving forward, as is the theme of this conference. But relative to the other concerns in your life, how worried were you about writing during this recent crisis? So I'll come back to each of those questions in turn as we go through. I'm going to talk about three broad areas. The first two are a bit longer, and the third I just felt had to be included. It affects all areas of writing and of instruction and just of life, this idea of well-being. I know some of the later speakers in the conference are talking specifically about this, And so if you're interested in this topic, I would encourage you to check out the other talks. But the three major areas I'll be talking about, some perspectives on plagiarism, writing instruction and feedback, and student and teacher well-being. So I have 41 and a half short minutes to go. Let's dive in then to the first point, perspectives on plagiarism. Now, this is something that I think as teachers, we've all thought about, actually as teachers, as academics, right? And even just as people watching the news, plagiarism does come up. There were some university presidents in the US, for example, who had to resign recently due to plagiarism scandals for their speeches. So plagiarism, and especially as academics and as teachers, this is part of our lives, right? We hear about it, we teach it, we think about it. And there are different ways of thinking about plagiarism. Now, a friend and colleague of mine from another major Thai university and I did some research about plagiarism that I'll share with you soon. But really, we were looking at the literature and we were coming up with our research and we were figuring it out. And basically, here are three major ways we can approach plagiarism, three different perspectives. And this isn't original exactly, but some developments that we're seeing now really might make it more beneficial to think about plagiarism in some ways rather than others. So the first way we can think about plagiarism is as transgression, right? Plagiarism as piracy, as theft, plagiarism as almost a crime, or in some cases even a crime, right? This idea of appropriation, of stealing, of taking other people's work or words without permission. So plagiarism as piracy, right, basically. A second way, right, plagiarism as a developmental phenomenon. And as teachers, we see this. Sometimes we see students who we know have good intentions, but maybe they don't quite have the language skills they need to paraphrase. So maybe they don't paraphrase quite enough, right? There are some sentences that are very similar to the source text. And this we can see as a non-transgressive phenomenon, as a developmental step, as a stage. Students are kind of passing through this as they reach the skills that they would need to be able to, for example, write an academic paper or an article. And the third way we can think about plagiarism is as a cultural or contextual phenomenon. So here we're not just looking at language and we're not just looking at the text, we're looking at the rules and regulations, the cultural views on voice. What does it mean to have a voice? Is it morally wrong? Is it ethically wrong if we're really very closely inspired by something? This does vary. And so, for example, where I'm currently living and working in Thailand, maybe the views on plagiarism are a bit different than they are in the US, right? Where it's much stricter in some ways about originality and who owns the ideas. So these are three different ways of thinking about plagiarism: transgression, transgressive phenomenon, developmental phenomenon, and cultural phenomenon. And so my colleague and I did some research about this. We surveyed about 400 students at two major Thai universities, about 100 teachers, about their behaviors, beliefs, and attitudes regarding plagiarism, some open-ended questions. And really, it was quite interesting. We found that both students and teachers felt that plagiarism was wrong, but that it was widespread. Teachers think about it in terms of integrity, that is honesty, right, academic honesty, but also in terms of development, right, developing language and conventions like using citations and references, giving credit where credit is due, and so on. Now, teachers also felt that sometimes students are playing the system, right, where the students know that if they plagiarize, it's unlikely that they will be detected in their plagiarism. Also, though, really there are inconsistent assessment procedures, even within multiple sections of the same course, multiple courses within the same major, multiple majors in the same college, multiple colleges in the same university. Really, there's a lot of variation in the expectations, and sometimes teachers weren't really communicating the rules and regulations very clearly to students, or explaining why they needed to follow those rules and regulations. Now, and when I say why they need to follow, there are different meanings of why here. Why in terms of, well, do it or you'll be punished, or why in terms of, well, how can you develop your language if you're plagiarizing? Finally, at least in the context that we studied, there was this kind of unwritten understanding that punishment would not be severe even if the students were caught. And we did see the students and teachers recognized, and especially the teachers, that really the teachers are the ones who communicate the policies and help the students to understand the context that they're in. So that's an important role for the teacher. And many times teachers weren't really communicating that clearly to students. Now, let's take a look at this, right? The value of classrooms. Classroom discussions are a much more efficient way to learn than online ones. Students can ask questions and receive answers in real time rather than having to wait for someone else to reply. Classroom discussions also allow people to learn from each other, et cetera, et cetera. This is a decent piece of writing. And actually, let's go back to that first question that I asked you about whether you could recognize text that's from an AI versus from a student. So this actually is from an AI. So this is from, from OpenAI, GPT-3. It's not available to the public directly, but you can access it through some websites, Philosopher AI, for example. Now, this one is a paid site. I did pay about 10 baht or 30 US cents to generate this text. But there are some others that are free, and actually some companies are coming up with AI that are very similar to this, but in an open source version. So how does this relate to plagiarism, and how does this relate to us as teachers? Well, GPT-2 was kind of a toy. GPT-3 can generate this text. Really, GPT-4, right, or 5 or 6, really, we're getting to the point with this technology where in the very near future, if students want to have text that is not recognizably similar to other text, that won't be caught and turn it in, or won't be caught by Grammarly or whichever similarity checker you're using, we're getting to the point where really we've maybe lost the arms race, so to speak, with students. So if we're viewing plagiarism as a transgressive phenomenon, that is, if we're viewing plagiarism as something where we're saying, well, do it because I told you, I'm the teacher, you will be punished if you don't do it right, this is wrong, this is bad, don't do it. And if the students don't see why they need to come up with original text and original ideas, really we're getting to the point where it's more and more difficult for us to compel them to do that. And actually for that text that I just showed you, I was talking about the content of today's talk with one of my students, actually my advisee for her senior project at Mahidol, Miss Noy, if you're watching, hello Noy. And she advised me, please teacher, don't tell students about this website, right, because they'll be tempted to use it. And actually, I think you can see the appeal of this for students if they don't see why they need to come up with their own text and their own ideas. Maybe you could see why they would be tempted. But this idea of this kind of arms race between teachers and students, where students maybe are trying to find a way to get out of some work and teachers are trying to detect them and stop them, you can see how there are many tools, and this has evolved over time. Now, ghostwriting has always been an issue, and it's been a possibility where if a student wants to pay someone else, say, to write their text, that's very hard to detect. Now, a lot of the online services, and I didn't want to name and shame any particular websites, but if you do a quick Google for essay writing services, there are plenty. Many are very expensive because they're geared towards developed countries, but it's easy to find online. In Thailand and some other places, of course, there are maybe more in-person services, some unscrupulous tutors and things that students might turn to. But still, it's not quite to the point where it's that convenient or that cheap to have someone write essays for you, right? And some students ask relatives and things who've already graduated, but it's not that common. Translation software, well, when I was studying French, when I was at university for my bachelor's degree in the early 2000s, the teachers showed us at that time, it was before Google Translate, we had Babelfish, right, Alta Vista Babelfish. And she showed us, well, if you translate it to French and back to English, you can see how poor of a translation it is. Don't use this because it doesn't work. But now, about 20 years later, really these translation sites work quite well. So if a student doesn't see why they need to write something in English, if they're going to write it in Thai or in whatever their L1 is, and they want to translate it to English, really it's very hard to stop, right? We might notice a few words that seem unusual, sure, but relying on detection even for translation is getting more and more difficult. Paraphrasing tools, and this is something you might have noticed. I've certainly noticed in the past years, occasionally getting an essay that looks very similar. Two friends will submit an essay, and the structure of the essay is very similar. The number of sentences per paragraph, certain things are very, very similar, but it's paraphrased enough that, say, Turnitin would not flag it as being very similar. There are services, so Quillbot is one example, and you can check this out. It can be a useful tool. It can even be a teaching tool, as can translation software. But again, we're getting to the point where as teachers, we can't really rely on being able to detect this. And I gave you the example for the 4th AI text generation. GPT-3 is just one example. There's much more of this coming soon. Even some websites on the internet, just at large, within the next several years, we'll see more and more websites with text composed by AIs, right? And some websites, some financial news websites, for example, already use AI to compose some of their text. So what are the implications here? And how does this relate to us as teachers? Well, I would say the time is done when we can rely just on punishment and on detection to get students to follow the rules regarding plagiarism. Now, we understand very well why students shouldn't plagiarize and how really they're just cheating themselves if they don't do the work and they don't take it seriously. But sometimes I think we don't do as good of a job as we could explaining to students why they need to be original, why they need to be able to develop their ideas, why it's important to their linguistic goals that they do their own work. And so what can we do? We can emphasize originality. And of course, technology like this, like what I just showed you, means that in the future, again, companies can use this as well, websites, different content developers. Now, for this, AI, what it can do is it can generate text. What it cannot do is it cannot think, right? It's not human. It's not a general AI where it's thinking deeply about these topics and composing something based on its ideas. It's very interesting, by the way, in terms of the corpus. It uses corpus linguistics. You can check it out. There was a great article in N+1 about this GPT-3, but it doesn't think. It just can put words together in a way that has some flow and that makes sense, right? Just based on word associations, not based on thinking, not based on critical thinking or logic. So as teachers, I mean, we've been teaching critical thinking as part of our language classes in many cases for years. Actually, you can check out some of the other sessions for this conference. Some of them are focused on critical thinking, and I would encourage you to attend those as well. But we can develop tasks that create a cognitive challenge. This is even something now, if you look at the available textbooks in our intensive English program, we're using PRISM for quite some time. And that's an example where critical thinking is integrated into the process that students are following, into the activities very deliberately and explicitly. So really, as teachers, one thing we can do regarding plagiarism, again, is to bring in critical thinking. It's not something in the periphery of our language class. It's central to our class, this idea of originality, creative thinking, and empowering students to have their own voice. And actually, our students care, right? There are things they care about. They care about the environment. They care about politics. They care about many things, right? They care about the future, right? They care about their future. They care about the future of their country and the world. There are so many things that they really care about, but they need to be able to express those ideas. And actually, so the theme under which we did our most recent curriculum review for our program at Mahidol, in the kind of freshman comp series of classes, our freshman composition classes and public speaking classes, we did a big revision a few years ago under the theme Vision and Voice. So this idea that we are preparing students for what is their vision, right? Finding out what is it you really care about, what ideas do you have that are important to you and important to society, and having the voice to express those. I think this was said just so well. The late, great Patrick Winston, he was a famous computer scientist at MIT. He has a great video, How to Speak. If you teach a public speaking class, I'd really recommend that one. But this quote just says it all. Your success in life will be determined largely by your ability to speak, your ability to write, and the quality of your ideas in that order. And so we do need ideas, right? We need to be able to express ourselves powerfully, and we need to express ourselves in a way that's culturally appropriate. We need to think about our identity, the identity of the people we're talking to. There are so many dimensions to this. And really, as language teachers, we just have the key to helping students develop such important skills that can lead to their success in life. So the idea that, language is just about text and generating text and error-free text, if students have a very superficial view of what they're studying, I can see how they could be tempted to generate text instantly. But if we're pushing them a little bit more about what they really care about, hopefully we can nudge them away from that. So really, it should be much less stick and much more carrot, right? Leading students by helping them develop their voice more than by trying to shoo them away from the easy way out. A few resources that might be useful to you in this regard. And actually this first one, maybe some of you have read it. This is a free book. Actually, the PDF is totally free. It's available online from the great Paul Nation. Thank you, Paul Nation. What do you need to know to learn a foreign language? This, by the way, this book has a list of 20 activities you can use in class, tomorrow to develop the 4 skills. I know we had some interesting questions about that, about activities. This is one that's full of activities and even some things you can do without internet access, if that's what's going on in your context. But one of the things I really like about this book, and I actually have had some upper level students even read some sections from this book and use this to frame the way that they approach their own study, is it does push you as a learner to think about, well, what are my goals? Why am I studying this language? What do I want to be able to do in the end? And helping learners to see their goal in the end is really one way maybe to steer them away from plagiarism. Also, this book, if you're not familiar with the 4 strands model for approach to language teaching, this is absolutely fantastic, but he talks about meaning-focused input, meaning-focused output, focus on language, so grammar, for example, and fluency, and devoting a fairly equal amount of time to each of those 4 strands. But if you look at this meaning, right, meaning-focused input, meaning-focused output, that's exactly what AI can't do, that students can do, right? This focus on meaning and meaning-focused output, meaning-focused writing is one way to make clear why we need to do our own work and just steer away from plagiarism. And this last resource, this video, this is from the University of Chicago writing program. This is not for students so much as for us as teachers and as academics, talking about the idea of value in our writing and giving value to the reader. So it's easy to get caught in this idea of writing as kind of a performance for the teacher, writing where, okay, the student writes, the teacher assesses, the teacher gives feedback, the student writes, the teacher assesses. But in the real world, I mean, outside of the classroom, when students are in their job or when they're speaking at a conference or when they're submitting a conference paper, actually what makes them successful is the value for the audience, not for their teacher. They don't have someone watching over them who's checking very carefully. It's the audience, right? They're trying to convey some meaningful thing, some valuable thing, some idea that they've come up with to the audience, and they need to be able to do that in a way that creates value, and it's clear that it creates value. This, by the way, is a wonderful video that talks about how to improve your articles for publication as well. So if you're interested in publication, I would recommend that you watch this video. All right, well, let's move on then to a somewhat related area, writing instruction and feedback. And what does this look like moving forward into this new normal that we've heard so much about? Now, and for this slide, actually, I need to apologize to the kind people who taught me to write, to my own teachers in the early to mid 1980s with my little chalkboard and chalk. I did study handwriting, but maybe I wasn't the best student of handwriting. This is my actual handwriting. Coming back to that question from the beginning, when did you last handwrite a high stakes text? And for me, and I gave this some thought, and of course I do write some notes to my wife and things that arguably might be high stakes. This may arguably may be high stakes. But the last real text that I wrote, the last kind of essay that I wrote that was high stakes and it was handwritten was 2008. Actually, I was taking a class. I had one class for my master's degree where I had some handwritten exams. For the other classes, everything was typed and submitted. I've since completed that master's. I completed a doctorate in education. I'm actually halfway through another master's degree, and I haven't really had to handwrite anything that was that important since 2008. So I write every day. I write memos, I write emails, I write articles actually. So that research that I showed you about plagiarism with my colleague, and I'll show you a bit more research we've been doing in our context soon. But really, handwriting is not part of the picture. Now, it's not that you shouldn't be able to handwrite, but maybe the relative importance of handwriting under the new normal is decreasing. And this is something that's come up in our own context. So say for our intensive English program, recently, even before COVID, we shifted to having students bring a laptop or netbook or other device to class, and we've been doing a lot of our writing typed rather than handwritten. Now, until recently, we did have a final exam set by the university at the end of our English for Academic Purposes intensive English program, where the students had to handwrite an essay to get admission to the college. Sure, we did do some handwriting, but we de-emphasized it as much as was reasonable under those circumstances. Now, under this new normal, right, what do we see? A growing reliance on technology. Maybe you've been tracking your screen time. I do track my screen time. I won't give you the number. It's a little bit embarrassing. Well, I guess I will. On average, about 8 hours a day between the different classes that I'm teaching and different things that I'm writing. For some of our students, it's even higher than that. So somebody might be online or on their screen 10 hours a day. We've, in many cases, we've been teaching these digital natives, and to borrow Prensky's term, for years. But now I would say there's even more of an expectation that we will integrate technology. It's so much part of their lives. We can ask students to switch off and to, say, handwrite texts, but it's harder and harder, and it seems farther and farther, or further and further from really what they're expecting to do in their lives, right? If they're studying English so they can get a job in a company, an international company in Thailand or in another country, really they're expecting that they'll be writing emails in English, they'll be writing reports and submitting reports in English, but almost everything will be typed. So it's a bit of a hard sell in many cases why they should be doing so much by hand. Expectations for technology integration into teaching. So technology is just part of our lives. We need to get with the program, really. This is context dependent, of course, and in different contexts, it's more or less possible. We do need to be careful of the digital divide, of course, the haves and have-nots, and some of the challenges our students may face. But still, to the extent that we can, given our context, there is an increasing expectation of using technology. Now, the good thing about this, though, is that we have a lot of tools available now that we didn't have in the past. And some of these really can be very efficient if we invest the energy in getting good at using them. One prime example, and so talking about free tools, Google Docs can be a wonderful tool. Google Classroom I've been using. It's actually, Google Classroom is free as well. If you're an institution and you get a domain and you can prove that you're in the institution, you can set up a Google Apps for Education account. You can set up Google Classroom for your students. You can give your students Google email addresses with unlimited storage. So we did set that up for our intensive English program in Thailand here. But Google Docs, anybody can use, and that's quite easy to share and to comment. That's free. But I would love, if we had more time maybe for the teachers here who use Google Docs, I would love to give a quiz about the keyboard shortcuts, right? For inserting a comment, for certain formatting things. Really, since we're using these tools and we're going to be using them moving forward, really we should learn to use them, not only learn to use them pretty well, but learn to use them efficiently. So if we can save a minute or a couple of minutes per paper, actually that adds up in the longer term. There's a whole ecosystem of tools that we can use, extensions for Google Docs. One that's popular at my college is eComments. This one, if you're interested, you can try it. I think it's maybe a 10-day trial period. It's not a subscription, it's a one-time purchase of $20 or $25 if you choose to keep it. Not that I'm promoting any particular extension, but this is one example of something that's popular at Mahidol. But there are other extensions that have similar functions. This one just has a bunch of comments already made, so it's very easy just to click, 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 and add comments to the student's writing based on comments that either you've created yourself or that are pre-populated with the extension. Again, this is something that can save a few minutes per essay, but when you're marking sets of essays, it does add up, right? If it's 20 essays and you save 2 minutes per essay, well, that's 40 minutes of time that you're saving. Sure, if you have Turnitin or some other tools, Turnitin has a similar capability, dragging comments on. You can set up your own bank of comments. You can just drag them quickly onto the essay where they belong. So really, we can think about making the most of these tools and trying to be efficient. So not only effective, but also efficient. Rubrics, if you haven't tried using rubrics in Google Classroom, they're absolutely fantastic, where you can set up a very descriptive rubric with the different dimensions you want, and you can just click, click, click. It adds the score up for you. The students can see exactly where their score comes from. And of course, Google will add it to your gradebook for the class. So very convenient. Another tool that integrates well with Google Docs even is Grammarly.com. So this, again, there's a free version which works just fine. I do explicitly teach my students to use Grammarly. I know there are different schools of thought on this, but since they can use it in real life, and since really actually most of us even as teachers do use spell check and other basic features of text editing software, I think it's fair enough for the students to learn to use these tools as well. And it does, of course, lead to some higher quality work in the end. Now, if you did want to balance some of these things, they have students handwrite the first draft of their essay, then type the second draft and use some of these tools to enhance it. Sure, right, depending on exactly what your goals are. You could do some things like that if you wanted to practice handwriting and spelling without a tool. So finally, and this Ludwig.guru is an example of a whole family of tools that are coming out, again, based on corpus linguistics. You can put a whole sentence in that will give you near matches from their millions and millions of sentences in the corpus. So actually, to be perfectly honest, I use this sometimes not only to teach my students, but in my own writing, when maybe something doesn't quite sound right, is it different than or different from? You can actually compare frequencies in the corpus, so different than or different from. In my dialect of American English, I'm from Rhode Island in New England in the US. And in my dialect of American English, I would say different than. I grew up saying different than, but most people say different from. And it's kind of interesting to look at, well, which of those is more common. So these corpus linguistic tools, which have a very simple interface, can sometimes be useful teaching tools as well. So what does this mean? Well, we as teachers need to stay relevant. Students need to see why. If we're not allowing them to use tools, for example, they should see why. So if you do have a final handwritten essay test to get into your university at the end of your intensive English program, students see that, understand it, you can explain, well, we have to learn both handwriting and we need to learn essays, typed essays, because you need to pass this test. There's a bit of a washback effect, sure. But if you say, well, you need to learn handwriting because I'm the teacher and I say so, and they say, but teacher, you know, I don't need to use this in the real world. Yeah, that's maybe harder to justify. So another thing, so as teachers, we can take the time to develop our own efficiency using technology. So not just effectiveness, and I think we've all at this point learned a lot of the basic tools, but not only how can we use them, but how can we use them as efficiently as possible. And one other important point here, and this is something that over the years I've just been astounded sometimes, both by my students' proficiency in technology. So when it comes to video editing, for example, they're just amazing, right? They're digital natives. They've grown up doing some kind of media manipulation that I had to learn, you know, much later in life, and tried, you know, I had to put much more effort in to doing. But I'm also surprised by some of the gaps in the students' tech ability. So I regularly have students, and you might try this out with your students, I regularly have students who don't know how to search within a file to find a specific word or phrase, right? So that Control F or Command F and searching for a specific word or phrase in a longer document. They've just never done that. It didn't come up in their personal or social life. And that's, as a basic skill for academic life and arguably for work life, they should know how to do that. So modeling some of these things, and maybe you as a teacher, right, if you have a projector, a camera, a projector rather, hooked up to your computer, maybe you can model how you search for things, right, and how you go about researching for something that you're writing. Some of these basic skills really can round out the students' proficiency. The same thing actually for Google. So obviously everyone knows how to use Google in the basic sense. You put some words in the box and click search and it gets some hits. And actually this course, it was created a couple of years ago, but it's still so relevant, power searching with Google. If you've never done this, if you think you know how to Google pretty well, I would challenge you to check this out. They have a bunch of videos that are recorded. It's very accessible. They talk about special operators for searching, how you can search for specific file types, how you can search within certain types of websites like edu websites, or or .org websites, or any specific type of website or within a specific website. So how do you search only within the World Health Organization website? Especially if you're teaching academic English, this is a very, very useful skill to teach your students. It'll save them a lot of time. They can get a lot higher quality sources. And it's just things that they don't know, right? So don't assume, although students would tend to have a lot more skills in some areas of tech literacy, in some areas they're maybe even less developed than the older generations. So those are some implications there. Now, for this last area, and I was kind of debating whether or not to include this last area in the speech, in the talk today rather, about academic English and writing and plagiarism. And I have to include this because this is so relevant to writing. It's so relevant to all aspects of students' language acquisition. And really it's relevant to education as a whole and just to life. So we are in the middle of a crisis, right? There's a health crisis, there's an economic crisis, but there's also really a mental health crisis. And we, as teachers, have a really important role to play. So we do need to educate ourselves about this, and we need to be able to help ourselves and help our students. And actually, once again, there is a talk later in the conference that's only about well-being and empathy and compassion, highly recommended. But just a little bit of context then. So emergency remote teaching is what most of us have been doing since, for us at Mahidol, it was, yeah, about March, and I think maybe March 21st last year was the last day that I taught on campus, that we came to campus. But emergency remote teaching is, there's this idea of rupture, right, of mandatory shift to online instruction, where you're not given a choice, you're not given time to prepare, you don't develop the materials, you don't necessarily even have the technology that you need. Maybe some students don't have great internet, some people are learning on a phone. It's not planned, it's not well resourced, it's emergency continuity of education. And this is highly stressful, right? And we've transitioned in some context to true online learning, where it's much more developed and planned and resourced. In some cases, we're arguably still in emergency remote teaching. Some places are hybrid or even back in the classroom. But still, this is quite traumatic, right, as an experience for our learners and for us as teachers. Here's an example of some research that came out earlier this year. So this is just a few months ago, about the mental health situation in 7 middle-income countries in Asia. You can see the impact of event scale, stress scores, anxiety scores, depression. Really, we've seen a tremendous mental health impact. And actually, you can see Thailand, where I am at the bottom there, is the highest in all areas. But we're in the middle of a mental health crisis. And actually, unfortunately, one of the conclusions of this article, and I will make sure to show the references at the end, and you can check that out on YouTube. You can pause it and look up any of the references if you want to dig deeper. But one of the major risk factors is kind of being a younger person during this pandemic. So according to this research in these 7 countries, older generations tended to be less impacted than younger people, right? Kind of high school or university age people especially. This is borne out also by some research that colleagues and I have been doing at Mahidol. So this was our intensive English program. We had about 420 students in our classes. We got 368 responses. In all of these areas, a lower score is better, right? So a lower score in anxiety means less anxiety, right? But you can see that from the beginning of our period of online instruction to the end of the first term of online instruction, actually in 6 of these 8 areas, the scores got better, right? They decreased, which is got better in all of these areas. So at the end of that first term of online instruction, students felt better about it. They felt that, okay, online instruction is more interactive than I thought. It's more effective than I thought before. It's more engaging. I feel more autonomous. I'm more open-minded. It's more convenient. These are all statistically significant results. Motivation didn't really get much better, but it was very good to begin with. Remember, 1 is the best score here. So motivation was approximately the same. That was not a statistically significant difference, but still great motivation. To me, the most concerning thing and what really jumped out of this research is that in terms of anxiety, the students actually got slightly more anxious as time went on. So even though they felt better about other aspects of online education, they just still didn't really feel good about it. And of course, we've all studied our Krashen, we've studied the affective filter hypothesis, we've probably read our Dornier about motivation and attitudes. But recently, there's a lot more research, and what I just want to plug here at the end of the talk is positive psychology and second language acquisition. So this is by Dual, 2019, the flowering of positive psychology and second language acquisition. And really, we can see that teachers are finding ways to educate students about things they can do to improve their well-being in class. Many of these activities align really well with language activities. And so this is something that as a teacher, we can try to find this alignment. We do have options. So for example, when we choose the readings we're going to bring into class, when we choose what we're having students write about, we can choose things that actually educate them, right? This idea of, in many cases, we have opportunities for content language integrated learning. We have some meaningful content we can bring in. This ties back to the idea of critical thinking as well, meaningful content. and helping to educate our students about how they can make themselves more resilient in the face of adversity. Now, the least we can do, right, is to remain mindful of this affective dimension of language education. If our students are really anxious, and by the way, that's why I started this talk with that question, relative to the other concerns in your life, how concerned are you about writing instruction? You're here, we have 593 participants. Once again, thank you so much for joining. 593 people taking time out of their busy days because you care. 594 people taking time out, 595 people taking time out of your busy days because you care about your students, you care about language instruction and writing instruction, you want to do the best job you can. But even for people who are that passionate, maybe that's eclipsed somewhat. You're concerned about the health of your relatives, or there's some economic consequences of the lockdown, right? Or maybe, I don't know, just any number of factors that are related to this crisis. So remain mindful and aware, compassionate to ourselves and to our students, and realizing that although the students care and although we care, sometimes that's eclipsed a bit by other concerns. When possible, you can incorporate some activities that foster well-being into your classes, and just recognizing again that learners and teachers have other things going on. I would recommend actually, and I'm running short of time, but that's perfect. I'm coming in just on the nose for 45 minutes. Some useful resources. I did mention that Flower into Positive Psychology article. I would highly recommend, and this is to take care of yourself as a teacher, right? When you're on the airplane and the oxygen masks come down, you put on your own mask before you help other people. The same principle. Really, many of us are quite stressed, and I was quite stressed last year during this mandatory transition to online teaching and learning. I did this course on Coursera, The Science of Wellbeing. It's done by about 4 million people now. It's effective, and you can educate yourself about how to maintain, to maintain your mental health during a crisis. So with that, let me just put up the references. Maybe in case you want to check these out, you can pause the video on YouTube later on if you want to take a look at any of these references and dig deeper into some of the things I've been talking about. So thank you so much, ladies and gentlemen, and I believe we have a few questions.
Thanks a lot. Great. That's fantastic. Thanks a lot. Lots of nice comments coming through. And I'm glad you picked up on the well-being section at the end, because at the end of the last conference, we asked participants, what types of talks would you like to hear about? And well-being was an area that was really, really prominent. So it still is important, and it doesn't matter what you do, what kind of job. When COVID hit last year, when we all had to have a different way of working, it was very stressful for everybody, students, for teachers. So it's still very relevant, still very important, because things haven't settled down, things haven't gone back to normal. So yeah, thank you. Thanks a lot for that. Couple of questions, just reading my handwritten notes. I was trying to remember the last time I wrote notes right now. Yes, a couple of questions here. So I think Pretty agrees with you that in regards to the Google Docs, it's saying it's a very useful way to comment and to provide feedback to students as well. There's another comment saying that you can also apparently record your voice on Google Docs as well. So not only for feedback, but I guess you could do oral exercises that way. But yeah, what about, I've got a question here. Let me just go back to it from Baka. It says, I think it was a quote that you had before. Shouldn't the quality of your ideas come before your ability to speak and to write? What you say or what you or write, you can't do it if you don't have good ideas.
No, sure. So that's, I totally agree with the sentiment behind that question, where in many cases, the quality of our ideas should be what matters most. But really often we see cases where the best idea is not always the one that succeeds, right, and gets taken up by society. Really, it doesn't matter how good your ideas are. If you can't express them, you can't get other people to learn about them, and you can't share them. So this one, I understand the question, but this is not an issue of kind of, morally or ethically, or which one is, the most important in some kind of higher way. In terms of pure practicality, if you can't communicate your ideas, you really won't be successful. Now, this, by the way, this is from a famous computer scientist. So this is not from a language teacher. And really, I think he exemplifies this. One of the reasons he was so famous was because he was able not only to have these ideas for computer science, but he could express them in a way that non-specialists could understand.
Going back to sort of the basic question from that about ideas, there are lots of comments about just basic tips on how you encourage students to get writing. Obviously, motivation is a huge issue for many teachers, which probably has got worse since people are at home, since you're trying to motivate students to write. So how do you do that? How do you get around that issue of motivation and to get students to start writing about something?
Oh, well, that's great. So we've had some really good success. I mentioned the curriculum review in our program, vision and voice. One of the things we've gotten into a lot is students' positionality, or their worldview, what makes them them. So for example, for one of my writing classes, we do descriptive writing, and we do a few readings. And then one of the essay topics, for example, is a place that's kind of holy to them, right? A place that really just feels magical. They feel such a connection to it. I mean, for that, it's just been amazing, the output that students get. I mean, some of the essays are so creative. I'm thinking, well, even when I was, a freshman at university, I don't know that I wrote anything that was that inspired. So I think sometimes making it personal can be a way for it to be interesting. Now, if you're doing, and I was an IELTS examiner for many years. I actually quit at the beginning of COVID. But I understand that if you're doing, say, IELTS Part 2 writing, it can be a little bit hard to motivate students. But if you have the freedom to do it, I would say one way to motivate students is to make it personal.
And what do you think about the idea of sort of peer-to-peer correction as well?
I think it's wonderful. I think it's a great idea. I would say that it's a great idea in several ways, because also one of the things that I hope came through in this talk is that often I think as teachers, we kind of hold students to different standards to what we're doing. But for peer-to-peer, I mean, when I write an article, and if you look at, I cited a couple of articles recently that colleagues and I did, we always ask our friends to take a look at it, right, and let us know, read through, make comments. That's a very natural part and normal part of writing. So it's not just something that I would recommend for students, I'd recommend it for teachers as well. When we're writing things, please do share. So I'm a big proponent of peer comments. Also, there's research about how students actually learn, in some cases, more by checking other people's writing than from their own writing. So there are just so many good things about it. And the other thing that I really like about it is it does keep them a little bit more focused on audience, because sometimes the teacher is almost invisible. The teacher can be almost a marking machine. Whereas when they say, oh, well, my classmate's going to see this, maybe it gives a bit more motivation to make it enjoyable or to give some value to the classmate. So yes, peer editing all the way.
Good. Another thing I was going to ask you about, let me just refer back to the question. I mean, yeah, it was the idea that if you didn't have much access to technology or not to Google or anything, how would you get around that? I mean, if it's not in a face-to-face class, are there other ways that you can, other means without Google, for example, that you would recommend?
Oh, sure. And I'm so glad people asked. And this is something where I know that in this talk, I've talked a lot about technology, and that's just in some ways become much more a reality now. But when I was first teaching in Thailand, I mean, not in 2005, I mean, I had a blackboard and an overhead projector. We certainly didn't have internet in the classrooms. The students didn't have internet. So I absolutely understand where people are coming from with that. there are different activities that you can do. I would recommend, so this book, by the way, if you're looking for activities that you can do, and many of these don't require internet access, Paul Nation actually first came up, I think, in the 1970s, teaching English in Indonesia. So a lot of his techniques are not based on internet access either. But a lot of the classic things still work. So if that's the case, you can still have students write, you can still have them do peer editing on paper. That's totally fine, doing another draft on paper. Actually, and one of the things I miss about technology, and maybe I'm showing my age here, is that I really love some of the props and cutouts and some of the amazing things you can do with paper, right? So you're doing a speaking class and you have tags that have words on them, radio, right? And somebody has it on their back, and their classmates looking what it is, and they're trying to guess, right? Playing 20 questions. So there are so many different activities that you can do. It's not that you have to always use technology. A lot of what I've been talking about here is adapting to the technology that's kind of pushed on us. But there are some advantages to being in a lower tech classroom as well. Maybe less tendency for students to be distracted, for example.
Excellent. And I think one of the final questions, we've only got a couple of minutes left. Gulnara asks about simply, what do you do if you have a student that clearly has plagiarized? She just asks, what do you do in that situation? I guess it depends on several things, the policy of the institution you're working at, but I mean, how would you go about that?
Well, no, that's a great question. And I would really say that one of the things that will help with this is that I would really recommend that for your classes, don't wait until you have a case of a student plagiarizing and say, what do I do? At the beginning of the term, when you're giving out the syllabus or when you're explaining the class, say, look, here's the policy, here's why the policy is like this, explain it and say, look, well, I fully expect you to do your own work. I understand that sometimes, I know you're learning to write, you might have some sentences that match a little bit, but it really is wrong if you copy and paste a full website. It shows that you're not even trying. Here's what the university's policy is. So if you're, if turn it into text or plagiarism, then I will need to give that to the program director for further action. I would really recommend, again, explaining to students why the rules are as they are, why they need to do what they need to do. But if there's a clear instance of plagiarism, I'm a big proponent of, following the regulations. But to be fair to the student, they should know the regulation clearly. I mean, hopefully it's given to them in writing as part of the syllabus. That's certainly our practice at Mahidol. It's in the syllabus for the course, explained on day one, if there's a clear instance of plagiarism. So it is contextual, and I would say that lay the groundwork. If it's something where the student maybe isn't clear about how strict the rule is, it muddies the water a little bit, but I would say, just follow the regulations for your institution.
Excellent. I think you had a good idea before. Were you talking about sort of running critical thinking around it? Maybe get the students to think themselves why this isn't a good idea and explore that. You could do a whole class, I guess, around that.
Yeah, right. Absolutely.
So I think that's all we've got time for, which time goes very, very quickly. But just like to thank you again, Dr. Alexander Nanni. There was a comment that your handwriting looked like a doctor's, but I was going to point out that you are actually a doctor. But yeah, thanks very much for that. And for everybody else watching, thank you so much for your time. Thank you for coming today. You can visit the cambridge.org/academic2021, and that's the numbers 2021, to see all the programme of talk.